At 12:17 on a freezing Thursday night in Chicago, a janitor named Mira Vukic stood outside Suite 4102 of the Regent Crown Hotel with a stack of fresh sheets over one arm and a county redemption notice folded 4 times inside her shoe. At 10 o'clock the next morning, Cook County was scheduled to auction the 2-flat on South Carpenter Street, where her 15-year-old brother slept with a baseball glove under his bed and a cracked ceiling above his face. And the number printed across that notice was not round, not cinematic. Not the sort of number people invent when they are trying to sound tragic. 138,413,17. Inside that suite sat Enzo Carbone, 39 years old, owner of a freight empire that handled refrigerated cargo from the south side to the lake. A man people in Chicago described in 2 ways depending on how frightened they were. If they were trying to sound brave, they called him a businessman. If they were telling the truth, they lowered their voice and called him the man who owned the docks after midnight. Mira had been told not to go in alone. Her supervisor, Denise Harrow, 52 years old, had pressed the sheets into her arms and said, "If he says leave, leave. If he says stay, call down. And if he asks your name, don't answer quickly." Men like that hear fear in the speed of your voice. But desperation has a way of flattening fear into something quieter and more efficient. 3 hours earlier, Mira had been standing in the county treasurer's satellite office while a clerk in a blue cardigan told her that once the clock struck 10 the next morning, the house would no longer be hers to redeem. Her late father had fallen behind on taxes while dying by inches over 2 winters of bad lungs and worse insurance. Her mother had died before him. Her brother was still a child, and Mira, who had graduated with a degree in forensic accounting 4 years earlier and spent every month since then scrubbing marble floors in a luxury hotel, had run out of places to beg. So when she knocked and the voice from inside said, "Come in," she opened the door. The suite smelled of whiskey, cedar, and the kind of silence expensive rooms have. The silence that comes from glass thick enough to keep the city out. A bottle of Macallan sat open on the low table. 2 crystal tumblers stood beside it, though there was only one man in the room. Enzo Carbone wasn't shouting. Men like him rarely did. He stood near the window in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled back, looking down at Michigan Avenue as if all those lights belonged to him and had merely been loaned out for the evening. He turned once, looked at her uniform, looked at the sheets and said, "You're trembling." "I'm cold," Mira said. "No," he said. "You're poor." And then, because whiskey has ruined better men than him, and because grief tends to make cruel people even lazier with their cruelty, he said the sentence that would come back to him months later with enough force to make him sick. "How much?" Mira did not pretend not to understand him. That was the first thing that made him look at her twice. Most women in that room, he had been told by the worst parts of his own life, would have played insulted for a few more seconds. Long enough to preserve dignity before trading it. But Mira Vukic had spent the last 6 hours being told by the city of Chicago exactly how much her childhood home was worth. And once a person hears that number often enough, shame becomes a luxury. She set the sheets down on the chair by the door, then she said, $38,413.17. Enzo did not move. The city below them continued without either one of them. Taxis sliding through intersections, a siren somewhere far off. Somebody laughing on the sidewalk with no idea what kind of bargain was being made 41 floors above his head. "Say it again," he said. She did. He walked toward her slowly, not like a drunk man now, but like a man checking whether the floor beneath him was solid. "That specific?" "Yes. What for?" "My father's house." "Your father's dead?" "Yes." "Your mother?" "Also dead." He took the glass from the table, swallowed what remained in it, and asked the question that mattered to him more than the others. Why the 17 cents? Mira looked straight at him. "Because that's what the letter says." And something in his face changed. Not softened, no. Men like Enzo Carbone did not soften in ways visible to the naked eye. But something adjusted, the way a lock adjusts when the correct key goes in. Because in his world people lied in round numbers. They asked for 50,000, or 100, or some beautiful invented amount designed to sound like fate. Truth came in ugly decimals. He reached for his phone. "If this is a story," he said, "you'll change a digit when I ask you twice." "I won't." "Address." She gave him the address. "Parcel number." She gave him that too. Her father had made her memorize every number tied to that house when she was 17 years old and still believed. Adulthood was something that arrived politely. Redemption deadline. 10 a.m. Tomorrow. He stared at her for a long moment. Then typed. By the time he turned the screen toward her, the transfer order was already waiting. $38,413.17. Not a penny more. "Once I send this," he said, "you don't come looking for gratitude. You don't come looking for rescue. You don't come looking at all." Mira's throat tightened, though not from what he thought. "I'm not looking for you now," she said. "I'm looking for 10A. And that, more than anything else, was why he pressed confirm. "Now if you're still with me, stay there." Because that should have been the whole story. A terrified woman with a number in her head. A drunk man with too much money in his account. One night bought and buried before sunrise. Clean, ugly, finished. It was not finished. Because 5 weeks later, Myra Vukic would be standing on the 19th floor of Carbone Intermodal Holdings wearing a borrowed blazer, holding a new employee badge in her hand, and realizing that the man who had bought one night of her life also owned the entire building in which her future had just been offered back to her. The transfer reached the county before 8 o'clock the next morning. At 9:42, the tax sale hold was confirmed. At 10:15, Mara sat alone in the kitchen of the two-flat on South Carpenter while her brother, Luca, ate cereal from a chipped bowl and complained that the milk had gone warm. He was 15, long-limbed, badly in need of a haircut. And still at the age where children believe roofs exist by natural law. He did not know that the house had almost been taken. He only knew that his sister had not slept. "Myra," he said, "did something happen?" She looked at him and said the thing older siblings say when they've just committed a small private crime in the name of love. "No, we're all right." She buried the redemption receipt in a folder behind the flower bin. She showered until the water ran cold. She returned to work that evening. And for 9 days she convinced herself that the worst thing she had ever done would at least remain solitary. Then the letter arrived. It was on heavy paper with the Carbone Intermodal logo embossed in dark blue across the top, and it invited Ms. Mara Vukic to interview for a junior internal audit position at a starting salary of $84,000. She read it 4 times standing beside the lobby mailboxes. Mira had sent out 187 applications in 4 years. She had heard back from 11. Most of those conversations had ended the moment people learned that her recent work history involved industrial floor polish and hotel bathrooms. Not conference rooms and spreadsheets, but this invitation came with a time. A floor and the name of a real person. She should have thrown it away. She should have torn it in half and let the pieces go down the trash chute instead. Because poor people are not given the luxury of rejecting miracles just because they arrive wearing the wrong face. She took the train downtown and showed up 20 minutes early. The interview lasted exactly 14 minutes. They asked her about variance analysis, vendor reconciliation, shell invoicing, duplicate freight charges, and how she would identify a false empty container bill in a cold chain logistics system. Mira answered every question. What she did not say was that she answered so well because she had spent 4 years reading textbooks in the laundry room, during her meal breaks, and another 4 years watching rich people leave bank statements, conference folders, and merger notes half hidden beneath hotel stationery. What she also did not say was that she recognized the family name at the top of every page, and had nearly walked out twice before sitting down. 3 days later, she got the job on Monday morning. She stepped into the lobby of Carbone Intermodal Holdings on Wacker Drive and felt for one dizzy second as if she had put on someone else's life by mistake. The marble was too clean. The elevators were too silent. Everyone wore navy, charcoal, cream, or black in the exact shades of people who have never had to choose between detergent and bus fare. The first person kind to her was a systems analyst named Owen Bell, 28 years old, who talked too fast and smiled with the relief of any man happy to find a new audience. He gave her coffee, explained which elevators stuck on odd floors, and spoke to her the entire way up to 19. Then the executive elevator opened. Enzo Carbone stepped out. He was sober. That was the first shock. The second was that he recognized her immediately. No hesitation, no squint, no polite confusion. His eyes found her face and held it for less than a second. But it was enough. He knew the entire corridor remained ignorant. He walked past her and said only 6 words. "Miss Vukic starts with my audit team." Owen blinked. "Yes, sir." Then Enzo kept walking. He did not stop. He did not lower his voice. He did not behave like a man ambushed by a night he had paid to forget. And somehow that was worse. For the first 2 weeks, Mira worked like a person trying to outrun humiliation by becoming useful faster than anyone expected. She reconciled invoices no one else wanted. She found duplicate refrigeration fees across 3 terminals. She flagged nighttime electrical draws on containers listed as empty. She traced storage charges billed after cargo had supposedly already been delivered in Indiana. By the end of week 2, people had begun noticing. And that was when the trouble started. Vivian Locke was 34 years old. Daughter of the private equity man who had financed 1/3 of Carbone Intermodal's expansion into international cold chain shipping. She was elegant in the way expensive women often are. Which is to say she looked less dressed than assembled. For 3 years Chicago society pages had referred to her as Enzo Carbone's inevitable wife, though he himself had never publicly called her anything at all. On a Thursday afternoon, Vivian stopped at Mira's desk, set down a silver pen, and asked in a pleasant voice, "How did housekeeping prepare you for forensic audit?" The room went quiet. Mira did not look up at first. She finished marking a discrepancy in a vendor file, then said, "By teaching me where people leave things when they think no one important is watching." Vivian smiled. "So you're witty too." Then she walked away. By Friday, the floor had a rumor. By Monday, it had shape. By Wednesday, Mira heard it plainly in the women's restroom from 2 women she had never met. "I heard she came out of one of his hotel suites at sunrise." Mira stood in the stall with one hand over her mouth and understood at once the worst thing about gossip. It does not have to know the details in order to reach the correct outline. She ate lunch in the stairwell after that. She stopped taking coffee in the shared kitchen. She kept her head down and let numbers be the only language in which she still trusted herself. Then, at 11:40 on a rainy Tuesday, she fainted in the archive room. She woke in the emergency department at Northwestern with an IV in her arm, and a doctor named Lena Shore sitting beside the bed. Dr. Shore was 35 years old, calm-faced, and had the kind of voice people develop only after years of telling strangers news that changes the architecture of their lives. "You're dehydrated," she said first. Mira nodded. "And you're pregnant." The room became very still. Not silent still. There is a difference. Silence is something outside a person. Stillness is what happens inside when reality steps into the room and every thought already there has to leave. "That's not possible," Myra said. "But it was 8 weeks, maybe a little more, doctor." Shore explained options carefully, thoroughly, without a trace of judgment. In Illinois, the decision belonged to Mira alone. No waiting period, no lecture. No permission required from any man who had ever touched her or paid her or frightened her. Mira listened to every word. Then she walked out of the hospital with an appointment card in her coat pocket and one terrible understanding in her chest. If she told Enzo, the moment would belong to him. If she didn't, the weight would belong entirely to her. She spent 3 nights sleeping badly, and one afternoon staring at the clinic number on her phone without pressing call. Then, on Friday, something happened that made every line in her life begin bending in a different direction. She was coming down the stone steps, outside the Daily Center after filing the final redemption paperwork when she saw an elderly woman in a camel coat stop halfway to the curb and put one gloved hand against the side of the building. Most people kept moving. That is one of the quieter truths of large cities. Unless a person falls dramatically, passersby prefer to let gravity finish the introduction. Myra stopped. The woman was perhaps 81. Silver-haired, exquisite and furious with her own body. "I'm fine," she said before Mira had asked a thing. "Your hands are shaking," Mira said. "They often do when I'm annoyed. Have you eaten?" The woman gave her a look that would have frozen younger waiters. "Who are you to ask?" "No one," Myra said. "But your lipstick is wrong." The woman blinked. "Excuse me?" "It's on the left side of your mouth," Myra said, "not the right. That happens when blood sugar drops and your hand starts compensating before you notice." The woman stared for 2 full seconds, then laughed once, very softly, as if surprised to find the sound still available to her. "You are impertinent." "Yes. Correct as well." I think, in the end, it was orange juice from a courthouse vending machine. Not medicine, that steadied her. Her name was Teresa Carbone. Mira understood the surname 1 second too late. By then a car had already arrived, a driver had stepped out, and Teresa, recovering color by color, had said, "Get in." "I don't reward competence by letting it wait for the bus." "I can't," Mira said. "You can, you may not want to." Different matter. Against her better judgment. Against every alarm in her body. Against the memory of whiskey and glass and one unforgettable transfer order, Mira got into the car. The Carbone house in Lake Forest looked less like a home than a decision someone had made and then repeated in stone. Daria, the housekeeper, brought tea. Teresa asked precise questions. How old was Luca? How long had Mira been supporting him? Why had someone with a degree been cleaning hotel floors? Why did she know the signs of hypoglycemia? "Because my mother was diabetic for 11 years, Mira said. "If you love someone long enough, you stop calling it medical knowledge and start calling it Tuesday." Teresa looked at her over the rim of her teacup. Then the door opened, Enzo walked in, removed his gloves, saw Mira seated in his aunt's sunroom, and stopped. There are moments in life when silence performs more work than shouting ever could. "This was one of them," Teresa said. "Before you become rude." She stopped on the courthouse steps when everyone else kept walking. Enzo said nothing. Myra stood immediately. "I was just leaving." "No," Teresa said. "He has all his life to practice suspicion." "Sit down. If you want to understand Enzo Carbone at that moment, you have to understand this. Men raised inside power do not fear many things, but they fear coincidence almost more than betrayal. Betrayal at least arrives detached to motive. Coincidence feels like a trap designed by God. He looked at Mira and saw not a woman with rain on her coat and vending machine orange juice on her sleeve, but the impossible repetition of a problem he had paid once already to disappear. Later that night, in the corridor outside the sunroom, he asked her the question he was ashamed of almost the moment it left his mouth. "How much did she give you?" Mira turned so slowly that for 1 second he thought she might not have understood. Then she said, "You really do believe every person can be reduced to an invoice?" He held her gaze. "It keeps expectations clean." "No," she said. "It keeps you from seeing people after you use them." And she walked past him. That should have been where the balance shifted. It wasn't, because on the following Monday, Mira found the pattern: nighttime refrigeration charges on containers marked empty. Manual override entries in Yard 9 after 2 o'clock a.m. Customs paperwork filed in duplicate through a brokerage firm that should have ceased existing 14 months earlier. Insurance on cargo that never appeared on any port entry log. It was not ordinary fraud, it was a machine. And someone inside Carbone Intermodal had built it carefully enough to survive years of inattentive eyes. Mira stayed late 3 nights in a row, tracing the chain backward until it led not to warehouse staff, not to dispatch clerks, not to truckers, but to executive authorizations routed through one office. Nadine Mercer, 32 years old, Chief Operating Officer. Immaculate handwriting, voice like cut glass. And the only person in the company besides Enzo who could approve after hours. Terminal overrides without triggering a second signature. Mira printed nothing. She took no files home. She knew enough about powerful people to understand that evidence only mattered if the person holding it stayed alive long enough to use it. And this is where the story tilted, because the same night she found Nadine's name in the chain. Mira opened her apartment door and found Luca sitting at the kitchen table with Teresa Carbone. The old woman was drinking tea from Mira's chipped mug, as if the whole neighborhood had always belonged to her. Luca stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "Myra, I didn't know if I should call you." "She just came in because your brother offered," Teresa said. "You might have been alarmed if I broke a window." Mira stared. Teresa's expression did not change. "Your floor has begun circling you like sharks circle blood." "I dislike inefficiency. Pack a bag. You and the boy will stay in Lake Forest for a while. I'm not moving into your house. You may call it temporary if that protects your pride." "It's not pride." "No," Teresa said. "It's fear, much more sensible." Mira refused. Teresa left at 9:20 that evening. Someone slashed both tires on Myra's car at 6:10 the next morning. Luca found a man standing across the street photographing the two flat. By noon, Mira had packed. Living in the Carbone house felt less like moving in and more like being filed. Luca was given a bedroom larger than their old living room and spent the first 20 minutes opening and closing the closet in disbelief. Daria fed him 3 plates of pasta. Teresa pretended not to watch. Mira moved into the guest wing and told herself it would be for 1 week. She stayed for 4 months. Enzo avoided her when possible, when avoidance failed. They spoke like hostile diplomats. He asked whether she had brought the Yard 9 printouts. She asked whether he preferred his lies alphabetized or chronological. He watched her work from the far end of conference tables and seemed increasingly unsettled by a fact he could not explain, which was that Mira never once tried to turn proximity into advantage. She asked for nothing. Not jewelry, not protection, not promotion, not a future. The less she asked, the more he looked like a man slowly losing an argument to himself. Then, on the second Thursday of October, Nadine Mercer made her move at 8:36 p.m. She called Mira and said the federal customs team needed the original Yard manifests from a retired bonded warehouse near the Calumet River. "Paper files tonight, no copies accepted." Myra hesitated. "Why me?" "Because you found the discrepancy," Nadine said. "If you want this job to remain yours, finish what you started." The bonded warehouse stood alone beside black water and rusted fencing. A long brick structure with broken security lights and one surviving office at the far end. Mira should not have gone in. But people who grow up on the wrong side of financial disaster are trained from an early age to believe that refusing a demand from power is more dangerous than walking toward it. She found the file room on the second floor. She found the boxes. She also found 3 shredded customs forms in a burn barrel that had not fully cooled. And then, 2 minutes later, she smelled gasoline. What happened next moved very quickly and then, inside her memory very slowly. A door slammed somewhere below. A chain dragged across metal. Smoke climbed the stairwell faster than fire ever looks in movies. Mira tried the rear exit and found it locked from the outside. She took out her phone and got 1 bar, then none. There are many ways a life can split in 2. Sometimes it is a gunshot, sometimes a diagnosis. Sometimes it is simply the moment a woman with one hand over her stomach realizes there is fire between her and the stairs. Myra wrapped her sleeve over her mouth, crouched low, and tried the freight lift corridor. Halfway there, her vision blurred. She sat down once. That was the dangerous mistake. Smoke convinces the body that resting is reasonable. And in that gray, narrowing air, with heat pushing under the office door and her lungs beginning to fail her one breath at a time, Mira said aloud, not to God, not to the city, not to Enzo Carbone, but to the tiny life she had still not decided how to name inside her own heart. "Stay with me." Enzo was in Lake Forest when the first call came. It was Luca. He was 15 years old and trying very hard to sound older. "Mira isn't answering," he said. "She said she was just grabbing files." Nadine told her federal people needed something. "It's been almost 2 hours. Something cold went through Enzo at once. Not fear, exactly." Men like him spend years teaching themselves not to recognize fear when it arrives. It was closer to violent clarity. He called terminal security, no record of any federal visit. He called Nadine, straight to voicemail. He called the bonded warehouse watchman. Off duty since 6, by the time he reached the river road. Smoke was already visible beyond the fence. Witnesses later said he did not wait for the firefighters to finish giving instructions. He did not wait for breathing gear. He did not wait for the chain at the rear door to be cut properly. He took a steel pry bar from the truck bed, broke the lock himself, and went inside. People who survive fire as children are marked by it forever. They do not merely remember flames. Their bodies memorize them. Their lungs do, their hands do, their sleep does. Enzo had been 14 when a warehouse blaze on the South Branch killed his father and older brother while locking in the myth that the surviving son would one day grow dangerous enough to replace them. So when he went into that smoke, he was not only running toward Mara, he was also running against 25 years of failure. He found her on the floor of the upstairs records room with her sleeve over her mouth and one hand still, protectively curved over her abdomen even in semi-consciousness. She weighed almost nothing when he lifted her. That enraged him in ways difficult to explain, not because she was small. Because she had been carrying too much for too long and no one before him had considered that a crime worth answering for. Outside, in the wet orange wash of emergency lights, she opened her eyes only once. She saw him dimly, did not seem surprised, and whispered, "My baby." Then she blacked out again. He heard the words clearly. So did the paramedic. At the hospital, after oxygen, after fluids, after doctor. Lena Shore arrived and confirmed smoke inhalation without catastrophic damage. After the fetal heartbeat came back strong and steady beneath the ultrasound wand. Myra woke to find Enzo sitting in the chair by the window with his elbows on his knees and both hands clasped so tightly they had gone pale at the knuckles. Neither spoke at first, then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Mira looked at the ceiling. "Because the first time I needed something from you, you named a price before you named me." He shut his eyes. "That child is mine." "Yes. How long have you known?" "Almost 2 months. And you were going to say nothing?" She turned her head then and looked directly at him. "What sentence did you imagine I could have used that you would not hear as leverage?" He had no answer. That was the first honest moment between them. Not tenderness, honesty. He stood, walked to the bathroom door, stopped there with one hand against the frame, and said without turning around, "Nadine Mercer set the fire." "How do you know?" "Because the only people who knew you were there were her. You and whoever she called after." He left the room. At 3:12 that morning, he shut down operations at 2 terminals. At 5:40 he had Nadine's office sealed. At 7 o'clock he learned that Vivian Locke had deleted 19 months of messages from her company phone and booked a flight to Geneva that had since been cancelled. Mira, meanwhile, remained in the hospital bed and understood something almost as frightening as the fire itself. The man she had spent months seeing as a wall had finally cracked. And what stood behind that wall was not softness but damage. Damage is more dangerous. Damage changes shape. When she was discharged, she did not return to the guest wing. Teresa moved her into a second-floor suite closer to the family rooms and told Daria to add on rich foods to every meal as if issuing wartime instructions. Luca, who had cried only once and in private, started doing homework in the upstairs sitting room just to remain nearby. Enzo became unbearable for about 10 days. He doubled security, he canceled meetings. He followed Mara's movements by asking staff where she was, and then pretending he had merely needed a file. He did not touch her, did not ask her to forgive him, did not try to buy one more inch of emotional ground. Instead, he did something much stranger. He listened. Mara gave him the full audit trail from memory, every duplicate invoice, every empty refrigerated container still drawing power, every override, every broker shell, every insurance certificate assigned to dead companies. And then she told him the part that mattered most. "This wasn't theft for spending money," she said. "It was structuring." Someone was building parallel books, not to skim a little, to move enough that when the collapse came, blame would land entirely on the loudest name at the top. "Mine." "Yes." He stood by the fireplace for a long time and said nothing. Then Teresa Carbone, who had listened to the entire conversation without interrupting once, set down her teacup and spoke a sentence that changed the center of the story. "That would be my fault." No one moved. Teresa looked at her nephew first. "I taught you to be feared because fear was cheaper than honesty," she said. "After your father died, bankers, aldermen, freight brokers, customs men, union intermediaries, every rat with a cufflink, all of them wanted a monster, not because monsters frighten them. Because monsters conceal them, so I let them build you one." Enzo's face did not change. But something behind it did. "You made me the front," he said. "Yes, while they used the dark behind me." "Yes," Teresa nodded once. The gesture of a woman too old to decorate guilt once she finally decides to tell the truth. "I kept the company breathing. I also taught an entire city to confuse your silence with consent." Mira watched him then and saw, maybe for the first time, not the man in the penthouse or the boss in the tower, but a boy grown into armor so early, he had forgotten where the metal ended. The next 12 days were war, but not the kind with gunfire. Myra built ledgers, Enzo opened vaults, Teresa signed affidavits. Outside counsel came and went through the library at all hours. Luca was sent to school with 2 drivers and 3 increasingly ridiculous lunchboxes, Daria packed as if feeding a small army. Vivian Locke resurfaced on the 4th day through lawyers. She denied everything on the 6th day. Mira found the overlooked detail that broke the whole machine open. Not in Nadine's office, not in the corporate server, but in a charity gala donor spreadsheet from 18 months earlier. 2 shell logistics firms had made identical, anonymous donations in amounts that matched the cents on separate overbilled fuel reimbursements from Yard 9. Same decimals, same habits, same invisible hand. Truth came in ugly decimals. The money trail led to a private holding company controlled by the Locke family office and administratively managed through Nadine Mercer's younger brother in Milwaukee. When confronted, Nadine did not collapse. People imagine villains collapsing because it flatters the rest of us. In reality, most of them become clearer. She sat in the conference room on the 27th floor, looked from Mira to Enzo to Teresa, and said, "You all still think this was about greed." "It was about succession." Vivian, she explained, had spent 3 years waiting for Enzo to marry her, merge clean assets, and inherit public legitimacy. Nadine had spent 2 years building a second ledger structure that could detonate on command once federal scrutiny hit. Enzo would absorb the criminal liability attached to the freight network while the cleaner investment vehicle peeled away intact under Vivian's control. "And the fire?" Enzo asked. Nadine held his gaze. "I told them to scare her," she said. "I did not tell them to overpour the fuel." Mara felt the room go cold. Not because the line was believable, because it was not. And Nadine knew everyone present was intelligent enough to hear that too. Enzo took one step forward. Teresa's cane struck the floor once. "No," she said. He stopped. That single moment may have saved what remained of his life. Because instead of answering violence with violence, he did the one thing the city had never once expected from him. He opened the books. Federal investigators were brought in with counsel present. Terminal records were surrendered. Internal communications restored. Nadine Mercer was arrested on fraud, arson, conspiracy, and obstruction counts. Vivian Locke left Chicago before noon the next day and would spend the next year learning that family money feels very different when frozen by subpoena. The newspapers called it a stunning reversal. Business networks called it strategic cooperation. Men who had once praised Enzo Carbone in private and feared him in public suddenly discovered the moral clarity to sound shocked. But inside the house in Lake Forest, where none of those headlines mattered nearly enough, a more difficult transformation was taking place. One evening, while rain tapped softly against the library windows and Luca was upstairs losing dramatically at chess to Teresa, Enzo found Mira sorting baby clothes Daria had bought without permission in colors so expensive they did not resemble actual colors at all. Found Nara sorting baby clothes at all. Daria had bought without permission in colors so expensive, they did not resemble actual colors at all. I'm not resorting, baby Cole. He stood in the doorway and said, I've rewritten the trust structure. She did not look up. For the company? For the child? That made her lift her head. No timed payouts, no leverage clauses, no guardianship tricks tied to marriage. Nothing that can be weaponized later. Mira remained silent. He stepped farther into the room. I don't know how to speak in a way that doesn't sound like a contract when I'm afraid, he said. That is not an excuse. It is only the shape of the damage. She watched him. I know. I was going to offer money again, he said. Something secure, generous, clean. And then I realized you would hear it as the same insult with better tailoring. That almost made her laugh. Almost, what are you offering instead? She asked. The answer took longer than any answer he had yet given her. Time, he said finally. And the right to refuse me honestly. There are moments in stories like this when audiences expect the music to swell and the woman to melt and the man to become. In one redeeming sentence. Someone entirely new, life is not so obedient. Myra did not melt, she said. You humiliated me on the worst night of my life. Yes. You thought I could be priced twice. Yes. You were wrong. Yes. She folded the smallest blue shirt in her lap, set it aside, and then said the sentence that mattered. Good. Start from there. Their son was born in late May after 19 hours of labor and 47 minutes of terror. He weighed 6 pounds 11 ounces and screamed with the kind of authority only newborns and kings ever truly possess. Teresa Carbone cried before anyone else did, not prettily, not delicately. She cried like an old woman who had spent too many decades mistaking control for love and had just been handed a second. Smaller chance Luca, now 16 and pretending he had not been crying in the hallway. Asked whether he was allowed to hold the baby before the rich people ruined him. Daria declared this the first honest thing anyone had said all week. Enzo stood beside Mira's bed and looked at his son as if the child had somehow arrived carrying a verdict. What? Mira asked. He shook his head once. For years, he said, I thought power was the ability to make people move when you spoke. And now? He looked at the baby again. Now I think it may be the ability to stop becoming the worst thing you survived. 3 months later. Mira returned with him to South Carpenter Street. The two-flat had been repaired. The back steps no longer leaned. The kitchen ceiling had been redone. Teresa had paid for none of it directly. Which was how you knew Myra had agreed. The money came instead through an employee restitution fund, carved out of recovered fraud proceeds. Properly documented. Taxable, legal and infuriatingly elegant. Mira stood in the front room holding her son while Luca argued with movers over a desk that had no right to be that heavy. Enzo stood by the window where her father once kept unpaid bills in a coffee tin and said quietly, This house survived because you knew the number. Mira smiled without looking at him. No, she said. It survived because I was desperate enough to say it out loud. He accepted that. That was new too. And if you want the rest, here it is. Nadine Mercer took a plea. Vivian Locke was charged, settled, and disappeared into the sort of international quiet reserved for wealthy disgraces. Carbone Intermodal spent 5 years under federal oversight and came out smaller, cleaner, and no longer useful to half the parasites who had once fed on its shadows. Teresa lived long enough to see her great-nephew take his first steps on the South Lawn in October light. Then, one winter morning, she died in her chair by the library fire with a blanket over her knees. Luca's latest report card on the table beside her. And peace on her face so unfamiliar that Daria had to look twice before believing it. Enzo buried her beside the brother and father whose names had once turned him into a warning. Myra stood beside him with their son in her arms, and said nothing because grief, when it is real, rarely improves under narration. Months later, in the kitchen of the old two-flat, where the paint still smelled new, and the windows no longer rattled in their frames, Luca asked the question everybody else had spent more than a year politely not asking. So what are you two now? Mira was slicing peaches. Enzo was trying and failing to assemble a high chair without visible rage. Neither answered immediately. Then Mira said, "Complicated." Enzo said, "Learning." Luca looked from one to the other, took a bite of peach and said, "That sounds like rich people saying yes with extra paperwork. For the first time in that kitchen." All three of them laughed, and maybe that is the real ending. Not the fire, not the money, not the scandal, not even the baby. Though he mattered more than all the rest. The real ending was this. Mara Vukic did not become valuable on the day a powerful man finally learned to see her. She was valuable on the courthouse steps when she stopped for a stranger. She was valuable in the tax office when she memorized the cents. She was valuable in the hotel suite when she told the truth in the ugliest number available. She was valuable before the transfer. Before the title. Before the house in Lake Forest. Before any man with a black car and a bad soul mistook payment for permission. That's the thing stories like this are always trying to forget, because forgetting it makes power feel romantic. Money can change circumstances. It can rescue a roof, it can buy time, it can even, on one exhausted night, alter the direction of a life. But money does not create worth. It only reveals the character of the person using it, and in the end, the woman who won this story was not the woman chosen by a feared man. She was the woman who refused to let fear become her language. What about you? Do you think desperation excuses the bargains people make, or do you think character is measured by what survives those bargains afterward? Leave your thoughts below. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who understands that survival and dignity are not opposites. And if you want more stories like this, stay with us. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in a beautiful speech. Sometimes it arrives in ugly decimals, smoke in the lungs. And one sentence finally said too late to be pretty, but still early enough to say